Here's a situation Scott Gaddis has been in more times than he can count. You're an EHS leader walking into a budget meeting with senior executives. You've done the work, you have the data. Incident rates, near miss reports, hazards you know have hurt people, and you're asking for budget to invest in a safety and compliance software platform. Then you start talking, and you feel the room go somewhere else. Scott has spent more than 35 years in environment, health, and safety at companies like Kimberly Clark and Bristol Myers Squibb. He's been in those rooms. He's made those pitches.
An EHS person goes into a room talking very passionately about the things that we know down here in our gut is the right thing to do. And we pretend that everyone else has those same values. That's our problem.
Over time, Scott realized EHS and finance were walking into those meetings looking at risk in completely different ways.
So they're extremely smart, right? But they thought in the terms of the business, and that's a kind of dangerous place for an EHS person to be because we're not trained to act that way, to think that way, to work that way. We're just built.
Scott spent years learning how to connect safety problems on the ground to the financial questions leadership teams were actually trying to answer. Today, we're looking at the language gap between EHS and finance, what it costs, and what happens when you start speaking the same language. To understand why these conversations fall apart, you first have to understand how professionals are typically trained to measure success. The numbers they're taught to track are things like incident rates, severity rates, days away from work, what Scott calls lagging indicators. These are measurements that tell you what has already happened. And for most C suite, that's exactly the level of detail they want. But here's the thing Scott spent years trying to get leadership to understand.
You can have a plant that has a couple of sutures, costs maybe 300 or 400 bucks to get that fixed, and they have a bad safety record. You can have that same plant that has two back injuries that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. They still have that same incident record, right? So unless you understand metrics as a whole, it's very difficult to understand if you're successful.
The incident count looks identical, but the financial reality is completely different. And yet, EHS leaders keep walking into budget meetings armed with things like incident rates instead of the risk lying underneath them. And that's where the conversation starts to break down. Finance, Scott explains, basically runs on three questions. What does the program cost? How quickly do we get our money back? And what value does it create over time? You might walk into a meeting asking for budget to reduce injuries like those back injuries Scott described earlier. But finance is trying to understand the business impact behind them. What does the company actually save if those injuries go down? When those numbers are difficult to quantify up front, finance delays or denies a request. Finance teams look at competing budget requests all day long. Vague numbers are hard to prioritize against projects with clear financial impact. And that's the gap Scott kept running into. EHS was talking about operational improvements. Finance was trying to evaluate cost, exposure, and return. One of the hardest parts of these conversations is that EHS value often shows up as cost avoidance.
I had a facility that 70% of my calls were razor knife cuts. So cost avoidance would say, I'm going to put a program in play, but that's going to cost us this much money to avoid all of those injury costs that I've had over the last year. Going backward, that's cost avoidance. We're going to avoid this cost from progressing because we're doing something.
That creates a difficult business case. You're asking leadership to spend money now to prevent losses that may never visibly happen later. There's no obvious financial upside attached to that decision. In many cases, success looks like nothing happened at all. And even when costs are visible, companies are often only seeing part of the picture. Medical expenses and workers' comp costs are easy to measure. But Scott says the bigger financial impact often shows up around the incident.
Indirect cost is where we kind of lose the conversation. Lost productivity, retraining, overtime, extra people to cover disruption of the schedule.
Production slows down, teams get pulled into investigations, schedules shift, and people have to spend time retraining. Over time, those indirect costs can become much larger than the original incident itself.
An incident that does not happen does not generate a loss, right? So it's not a line item.
That's part of what makes EHS value so difficult to quantify. The better the program works, the less visible the financial return becomes. Eventually, Scott realized that if he wanted leadership to act, he had to frame the conversation in terms finance already understood.
You really do have to reframe EHS talk in the terms of business talk.
So instead of stopping at incident counts, the conversation starts moving towards business impact. What does an injury trend mean for insurance cost? What does it mean for productivity or operational disruption? Scott also points to concepts finance teams already use, like experience modification rate and net present value. Experience modification rate helps companies understand how workplace injuries affect insurance cost over time. Net present value looks at what an investment made today is actually worth across the life of a program. Those are the kind of financial frameworks leadership teams already use to evaluate other business decisions.
You're never going to win, especially a big capital project, from a source of passion, right?
The proposals that move forward usually make the business case most directly. What does the company save? What risks get reduced? How long before the investment pays for itself? The problem was never that leadership didn't care about safety. They were just evaluating those decisions through a different lens. Finance teams were trying to understand cost, risk, and return. They wanted to know what changes financially if the company makes the investment, and what happens if it doesn't. That's why Scott spent years learning how to connect safety work back to business impact. Once leadership can clearly see the financial exposure underneath the problem, the conversation changes.